everyone, welcome back to Engage, where learning through play is the name of the game. Today we are descending back into the depths of Aperture Science to take a deeper look at the level editor for one of our favorite games to leverage for learning, Portal 2. Now, if you had no idea that this groundbreaking puzzle platforming game had a highly versatile level editor utility baked into its cake, don't worry, you're not alone. Long before anyone in the world of K-12 education used the words academic and esports in the same sentence, Valve once upon a time not only produced an exclusively educational version of Portal 2, they had also gone the extra mile and released that version of the game through Steam for Schools. Like most educators out there, I personally never had the opportunity to give Steam for Schools a try, but if a platform did exist today that made it super simple for innovative educators and IT support staff in schools to bring video games into the classroom in a way that was super easy to manage and took student data privacy very seriously, it would no doubt be in high demand. When I shared my story about how I leveraged the base game of Portal 2 to help students with learning disabilities make a breakthrough in learning how to write dialogue for their characters, I included a segment where I pretended to play Portal 2 on my Nintendo Wii, partly as a joke, but also to demonstrate how perfect it would have been had Portal 2 been ported over to that system at the time. Not just because the Nintendo Wii's motion controls would have been helpful for player accessibility, but also because transporting the Nintendo Wii physically would have been a way easier method to bring that video game into my classroom than having to lug around that obnoxiously bulky George Foreman grill edition of the PlayStation 3. Today, all you need is a Nintendo Switch thanks to the new Portal Companion Collection, or Valve's own Steam Deck, both of which can easily slip into a backpack or laptop case. And as long as you have a reliable projector or a classroom TV for everything we discussed in that episode, you're good to go. Granted, bringing a video game into the classroom that only one student can experience at a time won't have the same impact as being able to put that game into the hands of each and every student, but we have to work with what we have. That being said, while we can at least celebrate the fact that we now have more convenient means of bringing video games into the classroom in general, for the purpose of what we will be discussing today, please bear in mind that the level editor for Portal 2, at least at the time of the airing of this episode, exists only within the Windows version of the game. And on top of that regrettable limitation, it also requires having a stable internet connection. But why would anyone want to use Portal 2's level editor specifically in schools today?
For science, you monster.
Oh, right. I knew that. Whenever a player creates two interconnected portals, the kinetic energy of any object that passes through one portal is retained as it exits through the other. Hence, the portal games are excellent tools for exploring the conservation of
momentum, a function of mass and velocity. In layman's terms, speedy thing goes in, speedy thing comes out. Momentum.
While physics teachers could certainly single out specific test chambers in Portal or Portal 2 in front of a whole class to facilitate discussions on concepts like Newton's second law of motion or Hooke's law, clearly things would be taken to the next level if students were given the opportunity to engage firsthand in project-based learning and leverage the capabilities of Portal 2's level editor to build their own test chambers to demonstrate their comprehension and application of said concepts. Thankfully, even though the community that formed around the Teach with Portals initiative by Valve is no longer active today, you can still find investigative activity lesson plans pertaining to subjects like geometry, probability and statistics, language arts, even spatial intelligence, and you can find links to those precious resources in the description below. Of course, if you're anything like me as an educator, having lesson plans to consult is all well and good, but in order to really understand what a game that I seek to leverage in the classroom is truly capable of, I need to get my own hands on it and play around with it myself. Hence, the purpose of this episode of Engage is to help you get acquainted with the basic ins and outs of Portal 2's level editor, so you can hit the ground running with that exciting discovery for yourself. So first off, where do I even find this level editor anyway? We'll start by launching Portal 2 from Steam. Once the game's ready to rock, navigate over to Community Test Chambers. This will open up a second menu featuring your very own Aperture Science employee badge. From this point, the language used in their menus is not really as intuitive as it could be. One would think that View My Workshop would mean open my project files, but the workshop is actually the online database within Steam where all user-generated content for Portal 2 lives. And this is where, if you dig around enough, you might be able to find some of the sample test chambers that the educators who wrote those lesson plans we mentioned before built for reference. Instead, any test chamber project saved and in progress will be found under the same menu option that we select in order to begin creating a brand new project, which is Create Test Chambers. As you can see, here we have a list of my most recent projects on display, and you'll notice that even after I select one, the project will not launch automatically, nor is there any open button on screen to be found. Instead, what I need to do is select the project and then go down and select the gray edit button, and that will do the trick. We're here to start from scratch though, so in order to create a brand new test chamber, we'll need to keep New Test Chamber highlighted and then select the gray New button beneath the project list. And after a quick moment of loading, we now have our own fully editable test chamber.
Well done.
Now, before we get into any of the navigational tools or the level editor tools, let's first take a really good look at what we've been given as a starting point. We have a room comprised of mostly white walls, an entrance door, and an exit door currently adorned by some dark gray surfaces, and a curious looking little stick figure peeking out through a dimly lit window. What's important to note here is that while you'll be able to modify the majority of the elements of the space mostly to your heart's content, no matter what shape your test chamber takes, you will be required to keep the entrance door, the exit door, and that peculiar little window space intact. And each one of these elements will require having a certain amount of space in order to function properly. Knowing this ahead of time is vital, so you can plan on moving these required components off to the side and out of the way, so they won't cause any problems later. But I know what you're thinking. Hey man, what do I need these doors and windows for? Can't I just build whatever I want? Well, at the end of the day, the heart and soul of Portal and Portal 2 is the increasingly popular escape room format. And given that the original intent for this level editor was to provide Portal 2 fans with the opportunity to create and share their own ideas for puzzles with ease, it makes perfect sense that one would be required to have an entrance and an exit in order to emulate that core escape room structure where the player's goal is to solve the puzzles in order to find their way out. That window with the stick figure, meanwhile, is the game design team's way of guaranteeing that there will be a global light source present, so that anybody playing through your project later will be able to see and navigate through the space around them. Finally, it's important to take into consideration that any player exploring the spaces that you create will be able to launch a portal onto any surface that is white, but not onto any panels that are either gray or made out of glass. And while we're on the subject of housekeeping, in order to save a test chamber project, select File from the Level Editor taskbar and select Save As, or you could use the shortcut Ctrl-Shift-S. Unfortunately, from what I've been able to tell, there is not a straightforward way to find these project files in File Explorer on a PC. And when I had leveraged similar sandbox games in the classroom like Minecraft, I wanted my students to have the capability to be able to take their projects to and from home in case they needed to work on their projects outside of class time, but that just unfortunately does not seem to be an option here. Be aware of that ahead of time, because if you're going to use this game in the classroom in this way, you're going to need to assign your students computers to work on, because their project files will only be available on the same computer that they used to start their project. Bearing all of that in mind, now let's go ahead and talk about how to navigate our three-dimensional workspace. Using the mouse, if we left-click and hold down that button anywhere in the gray space beyond the boundaries of the test chamber room itself, we can rotate our view of the test chamber in any direction. If your mouse has a button in the middle or a scroll wheel, we can also click and hold that button anywhere in the gray space to free rotate, with the added bonus of being able to scroll up and down on the wheel in order to zoom in and out. And if you'd rather not zoom in and out in order to gain real estate on your computer screen because you think you might lose your bearings, you also have the option to right-click and hold down that button anywhere in the gray space to move the whole test chamber itself over to the side. Alternatively, you can also use the keyboard to manipulate this workspace. You can use the W key to zoom in or S to zoom out. Using A will shift your whole test chamber to the right to create some blank workspace, while D will shift your test chamber to the left for the same benefit. Using E, meanwhile, will rotate the test chamber clockwise around the Y-axis, and Q will rotate the chamber counterclockwise. Likewise, the R key will rotate the chamber along the X-axis to give you a better view of the floor, and the F key will help give you a better view of the ceiling. Finally, H will be your home base, making the entirety of your test chamber fit the screen and perfectly centered. Now that we know how to navigate around our three-dimensional workspace, let's talk about how to manipulate the size and shape of it. Let's start by giving ourselves a little more breathing room to work with here. The easiest method is to left-click and drag to make our selection of panels to modify, then hold down the spacebar so that our cursor changes into this double-sided arrow, and then left-click and drag away to expand or drag towards us to contract. Occasionally, the game can get a little finicky when it comes to selecting these panels with the mouse that way, so if we want to be sure that the game does not misinterpret our movements in any way, what we can do is we can left-click the panel that we want to start our selection with in the upper left-hand corner, hold down the Shift key, and move down to the panel in the bottom right-hand corner, and then click on that. And now that we have our selection, we can hit the minus key on our keyboard to expand the panel outwards, or hit the plus key to contract. We can also select individual panels one at a time to make more granular adjustments. While we're on the subject of modifying the panels, recall that any white panel in your test chamber will allow the player to launch portals in order to traverse across the environment. So if for any reason you want to prevent the player from being able to launch a portal on a specific panel, you can select that surface and use P to turn it gray, or you can right-click and clear the check that says portalable. This is a great opportunity to discuss how to test drive your creation before we dig into the incredible toolkit made available to us. If you move the mouse up to the center of the top of your workspace, you'll find a play button labeled Build and Play Puzzle. You'll also find an undo button, a redo button, and a switch to game view button. This is where it is super important to take note that unfortunately your test chamber project does not save or update itself at any point automatically. So in order to give your project a true test drive that will incorporate all of the edits that you have made to the in-game environment at any point in time, you must use the play button or F9 to activate that build and play puzzle command. The switch to game view command just allows you to toggle back and forth between editing mode and an instant in-game preview of your most recent save. Thankfully, the game does give you a clear warning about this if you switch to game view without having rebuilt the room first. Personally, I don't really understand why Valve bothered to include this switch to game view option, because one will most likely only care to see an instant preview of one's most up-to-date build at any given moment. But I digress. Now let's get to the fun part, our amazing treasure trove of tools. This, unfortunately, is the moment that I have to temper any excitement for any keyboard-only users out there, because for whatever reason, while Valve did incorporate keyboard commands for navigation and previewing purposes, they unfortunately did not finish the job for accessibility by incorporating keyboard commands for anything in the toolkit we're about to discuss. I, for one, firmly believe that every video game should be designed from the ground up to provide players with a full range of choice for customizing their inputs, but again, I digress. To open our toolkit, move the mouse over this gray bar on the left side of the screen. From there, to place any item into your test chamber project, simply left-click and drag your selected item to your desired location. Certain items will display a rotational arc or arrows after they have been placed, indicating that you can adjust this item's orientation. As we mentioned earlier, the game will require you to keep the entrance and exit doors and the observation room intact. If you modify a panel or attempt to place an item too closely to one of these required features, you will see angry-looking red error messages that will let you know that this action will not be permitted. The same warnings will occur if you try to place one item too closely to another that you've already placed, so be sure to give yourself ample space to work with. If you ever need to remove an item you have placed, simply select the item and hit the delete key, or right-click on the item and select delete from the drop-down menu. As you may have noticed at this point, the options that appear whenever you right-click on an asset in the level editor are contextual. In other words, the options made available to you will change depending on which asset you select. If, for example, we right-click on our exit door here, we'll see that we have the option to connect to, which allows us to create a connection between that door and another interactive object. We also have a checkbox next to the option called Start Open. If we clear that checkbox, we can actually see a little preview of the exit door being closed, indicating that when the player enters this room, the exit door will be shut tight. So let's give the player a way to open that door. If we add one of these giant red buttons to the floor of our test chamber, we can create a connection between the button and the exit door so that when the button is compressed and activated, the exit door will be opened. Let's right-click on the button and select Connect To. When we move the mouse away, we can see a faint blue line with a square icon at the end of it. The line in the square will turn bright light blue whenever the square is placed on top of an object that will accept a connection from the button. Left-click on the exit door and a pink heart will appear, indicating that we have made a successful connection. Now, while it is true that the player themselves could be used to weigh down a button by literally standing on it, once the player walks off the button, the connection will be rendered inactive. This is why so many puzzles in the Portal series challenge the player to figure out how to get hold of a cube to place on top of one of those buttons, either to open up the exit door or to trigger another mechanism that will eventually help lead the player towards their ultimate goal of making their great escape. Of course, unless you happen to be teaching a course in game design, you and your students will be leveraging these different mechanics to suit a wide variety of other purposes. Looking back at our first example, you might have noticed that after we created this basic interaction between the button and the exit door, that a strip of light blue dots terminating in an X icon automatically illustrated the connection we have created. This is what the game calls an antline, and as the types of connections you and your students could be configuring could become rather complex, you might not want all of these dotted lines scattered all over the place. Fortunately, we have a couple options here. We can keep it clean and remove all of the added visuals entirely, or we can choose to keep just the icons present in order to help the player keep track of which connection triggers which interaction. Both of these options can be found by right-clicking on the asset that is tied to all of these interactions and selecting either signage or none under connection visibility. By the way, not all connections in this game require the placement of a cube onto a button. We can also make use of the special pedestal button, which the player can simply walk up to and press the interact button in order to see what happens. Notice when we right-click on the pedestal button that we have the option to configure a timer so that the activated interaction lasts for only a short period of time. But what could be more fun than running around pressing giant red buttons? Well, lasers, of course. Whenever a laser beam cast by a laser emitter comes into contact with a laser catcher or a laser relay, that will trigger an interaction as well. Why use these laser mechanics instead of buttons, you ask? Well, as we've already established, lasers are cool. Secondly, there is a limit of how many connections one can establish coming from just one button. So if you or your students want to set up just one mechanism capable of activating a large quantity of interactions all at the same time, you'll want to use the laser relays. For example, when physics teacher Cameron Pittman created the simulation of the ideal gas law, he created a connection between a button that activated a laser emitter hidden behind a wall, and that laser was used to trigger multiple laser relays simultaneously in order to move that whole entire wall in the back of this giant container powered by multiple piston platforms. The purpose of this was to model what happens in thermodynamics when the volume of a space increases or decreases. Now in that example, presumably the teacher did not want their students to interact with the laser mechanisms directly. But what if you were creating a situation where you actually wanted the player experiencing your project to take control and redirect the power of one of those laser beams? Well, that's where you give the player the power of the reflection cube. This special cube can also be used to weigh down the buttons, so you could get even more wild with triggering even more interactions all at once. Moving on, and as an aptly worded segue, we have many different options available to us to facilitate player traversal. First, we have a simple set of stairs. By default, these will simply function like a seamless ramp one can climb or descend, but they can also be set up to collapse or deploy. But let's be real, the stairs are not what you're here for. The white angled panels can be set up so that the trajectory of the player or an object that has been set into motion can be redirected with the help of strategic portal placement. There is enormous potential for what you and your students can do with this mechanic. Next up, we have the track platform. After moving the platform into position, left-click on the platform to reveal 4 directional arrows. Left-click and hold on the desired direction to define the path for the platform to take upon activation. By default, the track platforms are set up to move automatically, but if we want the player to be responsible for activating their movement, right-click on the track platform and clear the checkbox next to Start Active, and then we can establish a connection as we demonstrated earlier. To the left of the track platform in our items toolkit, we have the Piston platform, and this type of platform will only move if and when activated by a button or a laser-based interaction. Depending on its starting position, once activated, the Piston platform will either extend outwards or contract inwards. Next, we have the hilariously named Aperture Science aerial faceplate, which is basically a spring-loaded launch pad. Any object, including the player, that comes into contact with the aerial faceplate will be sent hurtling towards the direction of its blue target. And as you might have guessed, you can daisy chain the aerial faceplates together by placing one springboard directly into another springboard's target.
Have fun soaring through the air without a care in the world.
To the right of the aerial faceplate, you'll find the infamous light bridge, and much like the stairs and track platform before it, light bridge will be set up to deploy automatically, but you'll get the most mileage out of what this unique mechanic has to offer by connecting it to a button or laser-based interaction. What makes the light bridge stand out from the other platforming tools available to us is that not only can it be deployed horizontally or vertically, but it can also be used to create a temporary barrier to interrupt objects in motion. Speaking of barriers, we also have the standard glass panel, which can be extended in a similar fashion to the track platform. Unlike the flexible light bridge, however, glass panels are stationary and cannot be manipulated by the player in any way. Glass panels can, however, be forged together to surfaces and other glass panels in order to create containers. If desired, glass panels can be swapped out for open grates. Open grates are semi-permeable barriers that will block players and other objects from accessing an area outright, but they will allow the player to gain temporary access to whatever it is on the other side through launching a portal. Simply create a glass panel, right-click on that glass panel, and select Barrier Type Grating. These options for barriers are often used in tandem with the Fizzler, seen quite often in Portal and Portal 2, primarily to prevent the player from grabbing a cube and taking it with them from one test chamber into the next in order to keep each individual puzzle design self-contained. By the same principle, you or your students could leverage the Fizzler mechanic to prevent the player from bringing a cube from one section of a test chamber project over to another. Or, if you want to get extra spicy, we could also set up a Fizzler to deploy on command in order to disintegrate a cube in transit. Something to keep in mind is a quick cleanup utility for complex simulations. Much like the glass panel or the light bridge, the Fizzler can also be used to prevent the player from launching a portal in a specific area. So between that and preventing the cubes from being taken anywhere you don't want them to go, the Fizzler can kill two birds with one stone. Or disintegrate two birds with one highly questionable technology. How exactly does the player survive passing through one of these again? Speaking of bathing the player in questionable sources of concentrated energy, right above the Fizzler, we have the tractor beam. When emitting blue light, the tractor beam gently pushes any object, including the player, towards its destination. Conversely, if one right-clicks on a tractor beam and selects Start Reversed, it will emit an orange beam that will gently pull any object, including the player, towards it. And if you create a button or laser-based interaction with a tractor beam, you can select Change Active State to enable the player to turn the tractor beam on and off, or you can select Change Polarity to enable the player to change the course of the tractor beam's trajectory. While one could leverage these unique tractor beam mechanics to drop cubes off inside containers made with glass panels, or to push cubes against buttons positioned on wall surfaces, the tractor beam is arguably most famous for being paired with our final series of incredibly useful tools, the gels. Any surface coated in the blue gel, which is also known as repulsion gel, will cause any object to bounce off of those surfaces. This can be used to send the player to new heights in all sorts of different ways. Any object that gets completely coated in blue gel, meanwhile, will bounce around uncontrollably all over the place. And as we saw earlier, this was another critical component to Cameron Pittman's ideal gas law simulation. Coating these edgeless safety cubes, or spheres, in blue gel was a great way to simulate the movement of gas molecules. Meanwhile, any floor that gets coated in the orange gel, otherwise known as the propulsion gel, will cause that surface to behave like a supercharged ice skating rink, cutting the friction down to virtually nothing, causing any object, including the player, moving along that coated surface to zip ahead like a hockey player barreling straight towards the goal. And with the powers of these gel mechanics combined, you could create all kinds of engaging interactions, which I will leave for you to explore. Following that, there's only one thing really left to discuss, and that's how students can share their projects. And this is where I very much wish that I could tell you that it was possible for students to use something like a secure join code system like what Minecraft Education Edition offers, or that students could at least download their projects to a file and upload them to Seesaw or Google Classroom or some other safe online learning environment so that their classmates can then download their work and experience their projects firsthand on their devices. But unfortunately, neither one of those options exist in this particular game. There does exist the ability to upload one's test chamber project to what the game calls the Perpetual Testing Initiative, which is a community database housed within Steam, but that is not a course of action that I could wholeheartedly recommend to you to take because, at least to my knowledge, there's no way as a teacher or your school IT staff or school community members as a whole could possibly regulate any sort of online interactions with the Steam community as a whole. And maybe this would be a different story that I'd be telling here if Steam for Schools still existed, but as we've established, sadly it does not. So therefore, the best option available to you to have your students share their project would be to show your students how to capture a screen recording of their project in action. And for that, I would recommend using something like OBS or Streamlabs OBS, which are a couple of free programs, and they're pretty intuitive and easy to use for this purpose. Despite its limitations, there's still enormous potential for how the Portal 2 level editor can be leveraged in schools today. And it's frankly a shame that the specific facet of this groundbreaking game has not been made more widely available beyond just the Windows version of the game. Considering the increasingly widespread adoption of academic esports, one would think that having a K-12 education-friendly Steam for Schools or similarly minded platform would make all the sense in the world in order to make it simple for innovative educators and IT professionals in schools to create and sustain safe academic esports experiences and educational applications of video games in schools in general. That's going to do it for us on this episode of Engage, where learning through play is the name of the game. Our ongoing mission is to help make the practice of leveraging games for learning more accessible to educators everywhere, and you can help by sharing this episode, smashing that subscribe button, and backing production of the show directly at patreon.com/Engage Show. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next time.